The year is 590 BC, and an Athenian statesman named Solon has traveled to Egypt seeking political counsel. While visiting the city of Sais, he is greeted by the priesthood. They begin trading stories, and Solon decides to regale them with one of the earliest Greek myths, that of the Great Flood, which decimated the earth. Upon hearing this, one of the Egyptian priests, who was of very great age, replies, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you." Solon, in confusion, asks the priest to explain exactly what he means. "I mean to say that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age, and I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. When the gods purged the earth with a deluge of water, the survivors in your country are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell on the mountains. But those who, like you, live in cities are carried off by the rivers into the sea. Whereas in this land, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below. For which reason, the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. Just when you and other nations are beginning to be provided with letters and other requisites of civilized life, after the usual interval, the stream from heaven, like a pestilence, comes pouring down, and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again, like children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times. As for those genealogies of yours which you just now recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. In the first place, you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones." The priest then proceeds to tell Solon an incredible account that would forever fascinate, confound, and capture our imagination. The story of Atlantis, the great ancient empire lost to the depths of the sea. Welcome to the Hidden Passage.
I met a traveller in an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
The first and only substantial account of Atlantis comes to us from Plato's dialogue of Critias. It is presented as a record of Plato's conversations with Critias, a student of Socrates. Critias was given the story by his grandfather, who had learned it from Solon himself. All parties involved in the transmission of this account believed it to be true and presented it as such. Yet most historians, even several in his day, considered it and continue to consider it to be a work of fiction, a cleverly concealed allegory to highlight what Plato saw as the folly of Greek civilization, and to provide a testament to his ideal state, as represented in his seminal work, The Republic. It is certainly possible that elements were imaginative reconstructions used as allegory, but I think it's very likely that it is based on an underlying truth. The concept of lost civilizations is not in itself far-fetched. Consider the relatively recent discovery of Göbekli Tepe, a massive megalithic site in Turkey that had been completely buried in sand, dated to 9,500 BC, far older than Mesopotamia, and built in a time when allegedly human beings were still hunter-gatherers and did not possess the technical capability of building such a structure. Since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have risen by 400 feet, submerging entire subcontinents of once dry land. What secrets of our ancient history could be hidden at the bottom of the ocean? You'll have to decide that for yourself. In this episode, we will first go over what was actually told of the fabled island of Atlantis in the historical accounts, and then explore a series of other myths that may corroborate this story. To set the stage, we will begin with an exposition of Plato's account, which describes the condition of Earth in the days of old. Critias states that in the earliest days of humanity, the Earth was divided amongst the gods into separate districts. Each was given a certain allotment and assigned as the stewards of their respective lands, which would become the various cultures and nations of the world. The gods then began to work their lands and people their districts, setting up the ideal conditions in which their civilizations could grow. They taught them basic laws and institutions, and all that they would need to know to flourish as a society. It is implied that the gods had some form of physicality, dwelling near and walking among the people. Quote, "They tended to us, their nurslings and possessions, as shepherds tend their flocks, excepting only that they did not use blows or bodily force, as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of a vessel, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus did they guide all mortal creatures." Poseidon, the god of the sea, claimed the island which became known as Atlantis. Although the Greek name Poseidon is used here, it is clarified that these were not the original names used in Atlantis, although the word Atlantis itself is believed by some to actually be in the native tongue. It is claimed in the dialogue that the island was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and was situated not far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, known today as the Straits of Gibraltar. It is further stated that beyond this island of Atlantis was a, quote, boundless continent, which once existed in the midst of the Atlantic Ocean. When Poseidon came to this land, he found it to be inhabited. In its center was a verdant plain and a lone mountain, inside of which dwelled the local people. There Poseidon fell in love with a maiden named Plato. She bore children by him, and they became the 10 great kings of Atlantis. Poseidon then established the capital city of the kingdom by shaping the earth around the hill, creating a series of concentric rings around it, and the space between them was filled with water. A channel was excavated that connected to the ocean, leading through the golden gates of the outer wall and into a large harbor in the city center. Poseidon fashioned 2 springs, one hot and one cold, and made every food grow from the soil in abundance, so that the people would have everything they needed and could sustain large populations of animals, including horses, who Atlanteans were allegedly the first to domesticate, and even elephants. Horse was the preferred sacrifice of Poseidon. It is interesting to note that sea gods and horse sacrifice to them were at one time in antiquity a common practice all over Western Europe. The Atlantean capital is described as having, quote, infinite abundance of natural resources, wood and metals, and they would use them to build the kingdom up to unparalleled magnificence, a level of wealth not seen in the world before or since. Surrounding the outer ring was a wall, covered in a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which was said to reflect a reddish light. In the center of the citadel was built the temple dedicated to Poseidon, which was of great splendor, covered in silver and gold, and within was a giant statue of the god himself, surrounded by 100 nereids, or sea nymphs, riding dolphins. Also in the city center was a pillar of orichalcum, inscribed with the laws that Poseidon had set forth for the kingdom. To the god's firstborn, Atlas, was given the capital, and the 9 other kings each ruled over parts of the greater kingdom. The 10 kings ruled with absolute surety, but were required to periodically travel to the pillar, where they would swear their oath to abide by the laws of their father. The most important of these was to never take up arms against one another, without the consent of the majority. The people of Atlantis were said to be of great moral character. Quote, "For they possessed true and in every way great spirits, uniting gentleness with wisdom. They despised everything but virtue, thinking lightly of possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. But they were sober and saw clearly that all these goods are increased by virtue and friendship with one another, whereas by too great regard and respect for them, they are lost and friendship with them. They remained this way for many generations, until at last the divine nature in them faded, as it, quote, became too diluted too often and too much with the mortal admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand. They, then, being unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see, grew visibly debased. But to those who had no eye to see true happiness, they appeared glorious and blessed at the very time they were full of avarice and unrighteous power. Zeus, witnessing this degradation of a once mighty and noble race brought low, gathered the gods to the summit of the world mountain and proposed that they be punished, in the hope that it would cause them to reform themselves. For reasons unknown, the dialogue ends here abruptly, as Plato left the work unfinished. However, as I've decided to retell the story chronologically, we will now cover the last event, which takes place at some point after this corruption of the people, but which is told towards the beginning of the dialogue. Evidently, whatever punishments, if any, were inflicted on the Atlanteans, could not steer their course, as the Egyptian priest tells Solon that in their reckless greed and ambition, they embarked on a military conquest and, unprovoked, launched an assault upon the whole of Europe and Asia. The Atlantean Empire is described as a mighty power that had already gained control over parts of Libya, as far as Egypt, Europe as far as Turania, and the opposite continent of America. They gathered together all their forces and sailed their fleet through the Pillars of Hercules, pouring into the Mediterranean in an effort to subdue the whole of Greece, Egypt, and surrounding nations in a single blow. And then, Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars.
Huh?
What was that?
Out of the frying pan.
And into the fire.
But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth. And the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. In another section, it is referenced that torrential rains also played a large factor in the decimation of both Atlantis and Athens, so intense that it actually flattened the land through rapid erosion. The Egyptian priest, later identified by the historian Plutarch as Sonchus, claims that this war between Atlantis and Greece, led by Athens, had occurred 9,000 years prior, which would put the destruction of Atlantis at almost 10,000 BC. This would predate the earliest known civilizations by much more than 6,000 years, as Plato states that Atlantis had existed over many generations. If this story is based on any degree of truth, confirmation of its existence would rewrite history as we know it, and would change on a fundamental level our understanding of the development of human civilization, even the very origins of humanity itself. Another lesser-known account comes to us from Proclus, who claims that a philosopher by the name of Crantor also visited Sais, wherein he was taken to a secret cave, and in its dark depths, upon an island in the midst of a subterranean lake, stood two pillars, one of gold and one of orichalcum, inscribed with the written account of the history that had been shared with Solon. The Egyptian historian Manetho wrote that these pillars had been created by the god Thoth, known to the Greeks as Hermes, shortly before the destruction of Atlantis, so that the knowledge would not be forgotten and lost to future cataclysms. Outside of these accounts, where can we find further evidence for Atlantis and the cataclysm that allegedly wiped it from the face of the earth? Perhaps the first place to look is in one of the most universal and oldest myths in the world, the Great Flood. With respect to deluge myths, 19th century archaeologist Francois Lenormand writes, "A recollection so precise and concordant cannot be a myth voluntarily invented. No religious or cosmogonic myth presents this character of universality. It must arise from the reminiscence of a real and terrible event, so powerfully impressing the imagination of our first ancestors as to never have been forgotten by their descendants." Everyone is familiar with the biblical flood and the story of Noah's Ark, so it is here that we'll draw our first comparisons to Atlantis. In Genesis 6, it is written, quote, "When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, 'My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown.'" Most scholars today believe that this passage actually refers to the interbreeding of divine beings with humans, which created a race of superhumans referred to as the Nephilim. This is the same story as the Atlantean god kings, the sons of Poseidon. We also have a connection with the Garden of Eden and the paradisiacal conditions of Atlantis. In both accounts, we have the same idea that people became corrupted, and in response to this, the deity became indignant and sought to punish or destroy them. This same deluge myth appears in the ancient Babylonian Akkadian epic, the Atra-Hasis, which predates the Old Testament by over 1,000 years. In this story, the character Khasisatra is a direct analog to Noah, an individual chosen by God for his virtue to be spared from the destruction and replenish the human race. The story itself is likely even older than its earliest transcription. This tale, in the form of a poem written from the perspective of the protagonist, begins with receiving revelation in a dream, in which the god Ea proclaims that he will destroy all life on earth in a great flood. He then gives detailed instructions to build an ark that will hold the people and animals chosen to survive. Khasisatra proceeds to build the ark, and on the day of reckoning, quote, "All that I possessed of the substance of life, of every kind I gathered together. I made all ascend into my vessel, my servants, male and female, the cattle of the fields, the wild beasts of the plains, and the sons of people. I made them all ascend. Shamash, the sun, made the moment determined, and he announced it in these terms: In the evening I will cause it to rain abundantly from heaven. When the evening of that day arrived, I was afraid. I entered into the vessel and shut my door."
Would you just please be quiet? Just shut up!
Musheri Inamari rose from the foundations of heaven in a black cloud. Raman thundered in the midst of the cloud, and Nabon and Sharu marched before. They marched, devastating the mountain and the plain. Nergal, the powerful, dragged chastisements after him. Adar advanced, overthrowing. Before him, the archangels of the abyss brought destruction. In their terrors, they agitated the earth. The inundations of Raman swelled up to the sky, and the earth became without luster, was changed into a desert. They destroyed the living things of the surface of the earth. The terrible deluge on men swelled up to heaven. The brother no longer saw his brother. Men no longer knew each other. In heaven, the gods became afraid of the waterspout and sought a refuge. They mounted up to the heaven of Anu. The gods were stretched out motionless, pressing against one another like dogs. Ishtar wailed like a child, and the great goddess pronounced her discourse.
Here is humanity, returned into mud, and this is the misfortune that I have announced in the presence of the gods. For the evil I announce the terrible chastisement of men who are mine. I am the mother who gave birth to men, and like to the race of fishes, they are filling the sea.
The gods on their seats were seated in tears, and they held their lips closed, revolving future things. 6 days and many nights passed. The wind, the water spout, and the diluvian rain were in all their strength. At the approach of the 7th day, the diluvian rain grew weaker. The terrible waterspout, which had assailed after the fashion of an earthquake, grew calm. The sea inclined to dry up, and the wind and the waterspout came to an end. I looked at the sea, attentively observing, and the whole of humanity had returned to mud. Like unto seaweeds, the corpses floated. I opened the window, and the light smote my face. I was seized with sadness. I sat down, and I wept. I looked at the regions bounding the sea, toward the 12 points of the horizon, not any continent. The vessel was borne above the land of Nizir. The mountain of Nizir arrested the vessel, and did not permit it to pass over. A day and a second day, the mountain of Nizir arrested the vessel, and did not permit it to pass over. At the approach of the 7th day, I sent out and loosed a dove. The dove went, turned, and found no place to light on, and it came back. I sent out and loosed a raven. The raven went and saw the corpses on the waters. It ate, rested, and turned, and came not back. I then sent out what was in the vessel toward the 4 winds, and I offered a sacrifice. I raised the pile of my burnt offering on the peak of the mountain. 7 by 7 I disposed the measured vases, and beneath I spread rushes, cedar, and juniper wood. The gods were seized with desire of it, and assembled like flies above the master of sacrifice.
Yeah, that's good. I need more.
From afar, approaching, the great goddess raised the great zones that Anu has made for their glory. These gods, luminous crystal before me, I will never leave them. In that day I prayed that I might never leave them. Let the gods come to my sacrificial pile, But never may Bel come to my sacrificial pile, for he did not master himself. And he has made the water spout for the deluge, and has numbered my men for the pit. From afar, in drawing near, Bel saw the vessel, and Bel stopped. He was filled with anger against the gods and the celestial archangels.
No one shall come out alive! No man shall be preserved from the abyss!
Adar opened his mouth and said, he said to the warrior Bel,
Instead of thy making a new deluge, let lions appear and reduce the number of men. Instead of thy making a new deluge, let hyenas appear and reduce the number of men. Instead of thy making a new deluge, let there be a famine, and let the earth be devastated. Instead of thy making a new deluge, let Debara appear and let men be mown down. I have not revealed the decision of the great gods. It is Khazisatra who interpreted the dream and comprehended what the gods had decided.
In this story, we have references to the same type of cataclysm described by Plato, a confluence of rain and earthquakes. The earthquakes are referenced here in the agitations of the earth and waterspouts, a phenomenon known as liquefaction, caused by compressed groundwater during tectonic shifts. It is also implied that Khazisatra traveled a great distance from his homeland and re-established society in a faraway country. As we will later see, this may be a reference to the survivors of Atlantis fleeing the island before its destruction and colonizing other areas. Flood myths exist in many cultures around the world. The Greek flood of Deucalion takes place at the end of the mythical age of bronze, wherein Zeus had resolved to destroy humanity for their depravity. Deucalion, the son of the Titan god Prometheus, is warned by his father of the impending disaster, and is told to construct a coffer for him and his wife. After 9 days of floating through the waters of the flood, they hit land on the top of Mount Parnassus, and are instructed by Zeus to repopulate by throwing the bones of the earth, or stones, behind them, which then turn into human beings. There existed an ancient Athenian religious rite called hydrophoria, where water and sacrificial offerings were poured into a fissure in the ground, near the temple of Zeus, where it was said that the flood waters had been taken in by the earth. This was done to commemorate the tragedy as well as to remember and appease both the victims and the gods. Pilgrims came from far distances yearly to make these offerings. An almost identical rite is also recorded in Syria. India has its own flood myth with uncanny likeness to those already described. Manu, another figure similar to Noah, is warned by a god in the form of a fish to construct a vessel to survive an impending flood. Tying a rope around the fish's horns, he is guided safely to a mountaintop. A year after the flood, a woman emerges from the waters and becomes Manu's partner, with whom he produces the next race of mankind. Yet another flood myth is found in the Scandinavian Edda, which tells of the slaying of the ice giant Ymir by Odin and his brothers in order to create the earth from his remains. When the giant falls, the story states that his body produces so much blood that it floods the world, destroying the race of giants, all except for one, Bergelmir and his wife, who survive by seeking refuge in a vessel. One of the most remarkable flood myths comes from Mexico. The reason for this is that it bears such a striking resemblance to those of the Middle East, despite being dated back to a time long before there was any known contact between the Old World and the Americas. The possibility of having been transmitted through the Asiatic migrations is virtually non-existent, as we do not find flood myths in the areas from which they came. Indeed, most flood myths seem to be concentrated near areas bordering the Atlantic Ocean and surrounding countries. This makes sense if we are to assume that the central point of the cataclysm was somewhere in the Atlantic, the effects of which radiated out towards both coasts. Also, the areas would have received Atlantean survivors, who brought with them the memory of the disaster at Ground Zero. In this Aztec flood myth, of which there are many variations among the various cultures of Mesoamerica, the equivalent to Noah is Coxcox, who finds refuge in a hollowed-out cypress with his wife, Xochiquetzal. In one version, it is described as a large vessel filled with animals and grains, which are said to be essential to humanity's survival. They are also warned ahead of the disaster by the god Tezcatlipoca and instructed to build the ark. They endure an apocalyptic deluge, and in a single day all was lost, which is the same claim made by Plato. The flood submerges even the highest mountain peaks, and when finally the god causes the waters to recede, Coxcox sends out a bird to find land. Eventually, this vessel comes to a rest on the slope of Mount Calhuacan, where Coxcox begins anew. This character is identified as the progenitor of the Toltec and Aztec peoples. The same legend is found in North America. 19th century scholar Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote the seminal work on Atlantis, titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, gives the following accounts. Among the Iroquois there is a tradition that the sea and waters infringed upon the land, so that all human life was destroyed. The Chickasaws assert that the world was once destroyed by water, and that one family was saved, and 2 animals of every kind. The Sioux say that there was a time when there was no dry land, and all men disappeared from existence. Ethnologist Hubert Howe Bancroft gives another account. The Okanaguas have a god, Skiap, and also one called Cha-Cha, who appeared to be endowed with omniscience, but their principal divinity is their great mythical ruler and heroine, Skomalt. Long ago, when the sun was no bigger than a star, this strong medicine woman ruled over what appears to have now become the Lost Island. At last, the peace of the island was destroyed by war, and the noise of battle was heard, with which Skomalt was exceedingly wroth, whereupon she rose up in might and drove her rebellious subjects to one end of the island, and broke off a piece of the land on which they were huddled, and pushed it out to sea, to drift whither it would, tossed to and fro and buffeted by the winds, until all but 2 died. A man and a woman escaped in a canoe, and arrived on the mainland, and from these the Okanaguas are descended. This story is interesting because we also get references to war, which triggered the destruction just as in the Atlantis story. One of the only places in which a flood myth is absent is Egypt. Donnelly states that the reason for this is that they, as Sanchez told Solon, had managed to preserve the precise history of the deluge, as well as many previous cataclysms, and therefore it never went through the mythologization process. They had no impetus to dramatize, understanding it within the context of many repeating Earth cycles, and apparently having been spared by at least one of them. With regard to these cycles mentioned by Sanchez, a pertinent piece of information lies in the Mesoamerican cosmogenic myth recorded in the Codex Vaticanus. Here we find that the history of the world is divided into 5 ages, each of which begins with a starting or a restarting of humanity, and ends in a cataclysm that destroys it. The first age, the Jaguar Sun, was said to be the age of giants, destroyed by famine, which caused them to be devoured by monsters, notably jaguars. In the second age, the Wind Sun, people were transformed into monkeys. This world was destroyed by hurricanes. In the third age, the Rain Sun, mankind was destroyed by a rain of fire. Here there is also a reference to human transformation, this time into birds. Sanchez likely references this rain of fire when he says that certain declinations of celestial bodies caused a great conflagration or fire upon the earth. The fourth age was called the Water Sun, which ended in the Great Flood, transforming humanity into fish. Our current age is the Earthquake Sun, which it is believed could end in a single massive earthquake, should the gods be displeased with humanity's conduct. The Mayan Popol Vuh manuscript connects these age-ending cataclysms with the gods' attempts at creating man. The first attempt creating humans that did not worship them.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
The second attempt yielded humans who had too much knowledge and power, so they were wiped out again. Finally, a limited and subservient race was created that was acceptable to the gods. This parallels the Bible, when after the Nephilim were created before the flood, God states that his spirit will not strive in man forever. We can probably view the Nephilim as an early form or prototype of man. Before God essentially nerfs humanity, we get this impression that they had more godlike abilities and longer lifespans. The biblical patriarchs were said to have lived for hundreds or even thousands of years. Perhaps this earlier form of man is in fact the Atlantean race itself. The idea of destroying and remaking man in these recurring cycles is also in the Babylonian religion. The Atra-Hasis flood myth we just explored was said to have been brought about by the gods because they found humans to be too noisy, and it basically just annoyed them. Before they caused the flood, Ea, or Enki, goes behind their backs to warn Khasisatra. The gods try to destroy humanity several times by different agencies, and end up regretting it when there are no more humans to offer them sacrifices. That's why in the story, when he gives the burnt offerings up, he describes the gods descending on them like flies. The same cycles are recorded in Greek myth in the stories of the Golden, Silver, Bronze, and Iron Ages, wherein Zeus keeps destroying humanity and remaking them into lesser forms. This idea will become important later on when we start getting into theosophy and the theory of humanity's spiritual evolution throughout the epochs. Exploring Mesoamerican mythology further, we find that virtually every ancient group which settled in Mexico trace their origins to a mysterious land in the east called Aztlan. Spanish Franciscan bishop Diego de Landa Calderon, around the time of the Spanish conquest, wrote, "In the Yucatan, the traditions all point to an eastern and foreign origin for the race. The early writers report that the natives believed their ancestors to have crossed the sea by a passage which was opened for them." The mythical kingdom of Xibalba is connected to this original homeland. With respect to its similarity to Atlantis, historian Charles de Bourbourg, in his introduction to the Popol Vuh, the foundational sacred text of the Maya, writes, "Both countries are magnificent, exceedingly fertile, and abound in precious metals. The empire of Atlantis was divided into 10 kingdoms, governed by 5 couples of twin sons of Poseidon, the eldest being supreme over the others, and the 10 constituted a tribunal that managed the affairs of the empire. Their descendants governed after them. The 10 kings of Xibalba, who reigned in couples, and who together constituted a grand council of the kingdom, certainly furnish curious points of comparison, and there is wanting neither a catastrophe, for Xibalba had a terrific inundation. These ancestors were said to have left their idyllic homeland and traveled great distances over land and sea before arriving in Mexico. In a series of images depicting the god and culture hero Zamna, he is shown leading the people away from a disastrous flood which destroys their homeland, and guiding them by boat to a new land. The Popol Vuh also states that sometime after this initial migration, 3 descendants living in the New World traveled back to Aztlan and later returned with newfound knowledge of painting as well as a system of writing.